They found bones under the kitchen floor. Not animal, human. The town doctor wouldn't go back inside. And when the preacher saw the names on the headstones behind the house, names that matched both the mother and the wife, he left town and never returned. What happened on that hill in 1892 was so twisted, so unholy, the county records were quietly rewritten. But one birth certificate survived, and it bore only a single name, his name. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are places in this country where bloodlines run like rivers, tight, winding, and never far from themselves. Western Appalachia is one of them. Isolated by jagged mountains and sheer poverty, families didn't move much. But the story of Jacob Elbridge doesn't come from poverty. It comes from obsession. Jacob was born in the winter of 1869 in a cabin deep within the Blue Ridge. His father was listed as unknown. His mother, Sarah Elbridge, was 31 at the time, unmarried, reclusive, and known to the town's folk only as that strange girl with the dollhouse voice. She rarely came down from the ridge. When she did, people whispered about the way her eyes lingered too long, and how she always bought double rations, one for herself and one presumably for the son no one ever saw. But he was real, and more than that, he was being groomed. Neighbors would later testify anonymously that they heard chanting from the hills at night, sometimes laughter, sometimes crying. But the most unsettling detail was that the laughter always came from two voices overlapping, both the same pitch, one male, one female, like someone imitating someone else or teaching someone to mimic them perfectly. Jacob wasn't raised like a Kyle. He was raised like a partner, a shadow, an extension. By the time he turned 15, he was 6 feet tall, pale as bone, and never came to town. But Sarah did, and she brought with her a ring, small handmade, carved from the wood of the very trees that surrounded their isolated homestead. The inscription on it, now preserved in a local museum, read, "To my life from your birth. Not a gift from a mother, a gift from a wife." The 1890 census lists Jacob Elbridge as head of household, age 21. But here's where the records fracture. There is no wife recorded, no siblings, no boarders, just him, and one other woman listed only as S. Elbridge, age 52, relationship unknown, no mother, no wife, just a presence. That year, local surveyors noted that the Elbridge land had grown. 4 neighboring families had sold their parcels within months of one another, all for far less than market value. All relocated without notice. Some say they were driven off by threats or by something worse, but they left behind livestock, tools, even their family Bibles. It was as if they had to leave immediately, as if something had changed. And it had, because that was the year Jacob and Sarah began building what would come to be known as the house with no rooms. It wasn't a traditional home. It was a labyrinth, 7 structures connected by narrow, winding corridors with mirrors placed in unnatural locations and windows boarded from the inside. The mailman refused to deliver past the gate. He claimed the trees surrounding the property were not right, too, leaning inward like they were growing towards something at the center. Locals started calling the place the womb, and Jacob, he began to be seen, walking the edge of town in his black coat, always barefoot, always silent. Children said he stared too long, that he didn't blink, that he smelled like perfume, specifically her perfume. By the fall of that same year, Sarah stopped appearing entirely, but Jacob began referring to someone again and again as my beloved. In conversations, in letters, even in a strange journal found years later in the ashes of their homestead, He wrote about her as if she were both alive and dead, a wife and a mother, a god and a ghost. One entry read, "She is before me and within me. Her touch makes me pure. Her name is my name." He signed it, not Jacob, but Elbridge, first name omitted, just the bloodline. In 1892, a local physician named Dr. Walter Griggs was summoned to the Elbridge property. No one knows who sent the letter, only that it was written in perfect cursive, inked in a dark rust-cold brown, and sealed with wax pressed by what appeared to be a human tooth. Dr. Griggs was hesitant but curious. He'd long been skeptical of the rumors, dismissed them as backwards gossip, but what he witnessed that night would haunt him until his death. His notes, discovered after his passing, and now locked in a university archive, are sparse but chilling. He wrote of an upper room filled with dolls made from animal bones and dried corn husks, each one bearing the same face, Sarah's. He described narrow hallways lined with portraits, all of the same two people, but aged to show their faces at different stages of life. In one, the woman appears as a teenager, the boy an infant. In the next, she is middle-aged and he a young man, but in the final portrait they are shown as husband and wife, standing hand in hand with eyes identical and mouths sewn shut with thread. But it was what he found beneath the house that broke him. A root cellar had been expanded, almost tunneled into the earth. What began as a pantry deepened into a passageway of packed dirt and scorched beams. At its end, a crude chapel, and in the center, a bed. Upon it, the skeletal remains of a woman veiled in lace, her hands folded over a withered bouquet. Above her, painted crudely in what Griggs believed was dried blood, the words, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Griggs fled without taking further notes. He never returned, never spoke publicly, and when pressed, claimed he had seen a union not blessed by God nor man. What the town didn't know was that by the time he entered that house, Sarah Elbridge had been dead for over a year, but Jacob never buried her. Instead, he preserved her, maintained her, kept her body in a sacred space below ground, and continued to refer to her in writing and conversation as both his mother and his spouse. By the late 1890s, Jacob Elbridge had become less man than myth. Stories spread like wildfire through the region, whispers of chanting heard through the trees, sightings of a pale figure walking in circles at dusk, and the persistent belief that the Elbridge bloodline had violated some cosmic law. But something changed in 1898. A fire. No one knows how it started, but it moved fast. Too fast for the local soil, which was notoriously damp in summer. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was gone. Or rather, it had collapsed in on itself. The womb, as it was mockingly called, had become a grave. What they found in the ruins shocked even the most skeptical. 3 bodies. The first was easily identified as Jacob. His spine severely twisted, arms crossed over his chest, teeth filed down to sharp points. Around his neck was a rotting cord of braided hair, Sarah's hair. The second was Sarah herself, still in the same pose on chapel bed beneath the house. Her skin had been treated with some kind of resin, her eyes covered with small white stones. One hand rested on a Bible, the other clutched a lock of Jacob's hair. But the third body, charred, malformed, smaller, was unaccounted for. It appeared to be a child, but with adult proportions. Its face was severely disfigured, as if the bone structure had collapsed in on itself, and its fingers, 6 on each hand. No records existed of another person living there. No woman had ever been seen entering the property. But what unsettled the coroner most wasn't the extra digits or the deformities, it was the jaw. The third body's jawbone matched Jacob's almost perfectly. Not just genetically, but structurally, anomalies in the MERS, the same crooked incisor, even a fracture from childhood that had healed improperly. The odds were astronomical. The implication Jacob had fathered a child with his mother, and the child had lived and died possibly in that fire. Some locals claim Jacob set the house ablaze himself. either in shame or in the belief that only fire could release them from what they had become. Others believe it was the town that someone or something wanted the Elbridge name erased, but it didn't work because months later a new name appeared in the church registry. E. Jacobson, age 7, orphan, adopted. The name E. Jacobson seemed innocuous enough, just another orphan in a town that preferred not to ask questions. He was taken in by Reverend Clean, a man known for his charity and unfortunate luck with children. His wife had died during childbirth, and his own son had drowned years prior. Locals believed the Reverend saw this new boy as a second chance, but strange things began happening almost immediately. E. Jacobson refused to sleep indoors. He insisted on building a small shelter behind the church fashioned from branches, roots, and discarded cloth. When questioned, he said the church walls crushed the voices. When asked what voices, he'd reply simply, "The ones that sing her name." He never mentioned his parents, never asked where they went, but he did carve a small wooden object, a ring identical to the one Sarah Elbridge had given Jacob decades prior, and he wore it constantly. Reverend Clean began keeping a journal documenting the child's behavior. At first, it was minor, strange drawings. Sleepwalking, repeating phrases in a language no one recognized, but by winter the entries became frantic. "He doesn't age," Clean wrote. "His face changes subtly. I swear he smiles like an old man. Sometimes I hear two voices when he speaks, one high, one low. He keeps calling me father, but with a tone that chills me, like I am less than him, like I am the child." One night, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, Clean awoke to find E. Jacobson standing over his bed, soaking wet, smiling. In his hand, a burned piece of paper with smeared ink. The only legible words, "Bride returns when the sun is ready." That was the last night E. Jacobson was seen in public. Klein's home burned to the ground 3 days later. His body was found in the cellar, positioned exactly like Sarah Elbridge had been, eyes covered, hands folded, mouth stitched shut. The boy was gone. No footprints, no witnesses, just one final journal entry scratched into the wall of the shelter behind the church. "She came back, not as before, but as fire, and she took me in her arms. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" Decades passed. The Elbridge name faded from memory on purpose. Locals began referring to that ridge as the burned place, a name their children learned not to ask about. And church records where E. Jacobson had been written were mysteriously lost in a flood in 1911. But trauma, even when buried, has a way of blooming underground. In 1934, a government surveyor named Louis Penn was sent to document old land titles for a rural electrification project. He was thorough, obsessive even. He wanted to map everything, every stone wall, every broken fence, and that's how he found it. At the top of a ridge, long overgrown, was a well. At least that's what he thought until he removed the rotten wood covering it and found stairs instead. Spiral carved from stone leading down into total darkness. Penn was not a superstitious man. He carried a flashlight, rope, and a revolver. He descended alone. His personal field notes, later recovered from his abandoned vehicle, describe a winding descent into what he called a room that feels older than the land around it. It was circular, with walls covered in mirrors, each cracked down the center, but positioned to face each other endlessly. In the middle sat a wooden chair, small and child-sized, and on the walls, painted in faded red again, the phrase, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Next to the chair lay a ring. Penn picked it up, described it in detail, wooden carved identical to the one from the Elbridge archives. But what disturbed him was the name burned into the inside, E. Jacobson. He tried to leave, but something followed him. That's what he wrote in the margins of the notes in increasingly frantic handwriting. "It knows my name. It's watching through the mirrors. She's here." Then nothing. His flashlight was later recovered, found in the woods 5 mi from the ridge, batteries intact. His revolver was discovered in a creek, rusted but loaded. Penn was never seen again. To this day, locals refuse to hike that ridge. Hunters say the birds won't fly over it, and some say that on windless nights, if you stand quietly, you'll hear something echoing from beneath the earth. Two voices, one male, one female, singing the same name. There are families in American history whose sins are recorded in court documents, newspaper clippings, and death certificates. But the Elbridges are not one of them. Their story lives in whispers in burned journals and in the buried guilt of a town that tried to forget. But forgetting does not mean erasing. In 1979, a graduate student from University of Virginia, researching folklore for his dissertation, stumbled across the name Jacob Elbridge in a faded newspaper tucked into a church Bible for preservation. The article was brief. Just a single sentence: J. Elbridge, presumed dead in the fire, 1898. No kin, but the student, intrigued, dug deeper. What he found was a scattered paper trail, odd purchases from old ledgers, land deeds signed with only an initial, and dozens of missing person reports filed over a span of 80 years, all near the same wooded ridge. He tried to map them. Every incident, every unexplained disappearance, every burned home, and what emerged chilled him to his core, a spiral, the center of which was the old Elbridge property. His research was never published. His professor dismissed it as hysteria disguised as anthropology. But the student's notes, later found by his roommate, revealed something else. Drawings, dozens of them, each one of a woman in a wedding veil, no eyes, just empty sockets filled with hair, and a boy beside her, growing older in each image until finally, in the last sketch, they were the same. A man and woman, hand in hand, with mouths sewn shut and a ring on each finger. One final note sat at the bottom of the folder, handwritten and seemingly scrolled in panic. The line never broke. The blood runs backward. She marries what she births, and he births what he marries. In 1981, the student vanished on a hiking trip near the same ridge. His body was never recovered. Only his camera was found, its final photo showing a shadowed figure in a white dress half hidden behind a crooked tree. Some say it was a prank. Others say it was her. But those who have lived long in that region, they never speak her name, never walk the ridge, and never wear rings carved from wood. Because the Elbridge legacy isn't a family tree. It's a circle, unbroken, eternal, rotating in silence beneath the roots of America.